you're getting so much better, but that was still pretty lousy. Buenos dias. That's better. Okay. It's the last day. You guys have made it. How's the conference been so far? Yeah? Good. I went down and I checked out those boards. I see lots of good suggestions down there, so keep them coming. That's really great. Couple of things this morning. Again, in keeping with recognizing different groups, I want to look around here. I know people are still trickling in, but we have a couple other entities that are part of SCB that are really important. And so working groups, you've heard a lot about them this week if you've gone to a lot of the sessions. But who in this room is part of a working group? Raise your hand. Okay, now stand up because that's really impressive. Working groups. This is really incredible. So here's another opportunity if you're here as a guest that you can get involved with SCB and have a huge contribution. Thank you all very much for what you're doing. And now here's a big one. Let's talk about chapters. How many of you here are involved in chapters? Lots and lots and lots. Stand up, get some exercise. Everybody stand up, chapters. Thank you for being involved in all that you're doing. That's great. Spread the word. Okay, a few more announcements. How many of you went to the career fair last night? Lots of people. Was it a good event? Excellent. So the career fair, I'm not sure if you noticed it well, but you should have, was sponsored by Wiley. Wiley is the publisher that also handles conservation biology, conservation letters. I think Gillian, are you here somewhere? She might not be in the room. But they deserve a round of applause because they did a fantastic job. Great. So, what else are we going to talk about today? There's a lot of stuff that's happening today. We have our members meeting today. This is such an exciting event. You all need to go to the members meeting. You never know what's going to happen there. I'm just saying, I'm new here, but I'm trying to find some fun surprises. So you might find out where the location of the next ICCB is. You might be able to enter a raffle as you walk into the room to win a free registration to that event. Yeah, it could be good. Besides, you're going to learn about the organization in a way that you should, and it's only an hour, so you should come. Okay, so that's my plug for the members meeting. Silent auction is also going to happen this evening at the closing ceremony. Merritt, are you in here somewhere? Maybe not. Silent auction, we have got a ton of excellent stuff. They keep coming up into the staff workroom. It's an amazing amount of goods that are there. So thank you to all of you that have made donations, but also go down there early, sign up early on all the things, and keep checking and keep putting your bids in there because that all goes to the chapters. So all of you that stood up in chapters, all the funds that come from that silent auction help provide grants for those of you to come to this conference. So go and bid and keep bidding on them. Last announcement, two announcements. We have, if you haven't picked up your t-shirts yet, go get them. Otherwise they'll end up in the silent auction because today's the last day. And then one last thing, today's coffee break is courtesy of Agro Berlin, organic bird-friendly coffee farm, and it's in the Sierra Nevada, Santa Marta, and in the Sierra Nevada, sorry, I'm having trouble here. This is also courtesy of the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, and they are providing the coffee this afternoon. So nice hand for them. And I think that's all I have this morning. So I'm going to bring Miranda back up here. Again, she's the chair of the scientific committee. She's going to introduce our plenary speaker this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Amazing to see so many people here on the last day. You didn't spend too much time salsa dancing last night, I see. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Professor E.J. Milner-Gilland. E.J. is the director of Interdisciplinary Center for Conservation Science at the University of Oxford. She is focused on predicting human behavior to improve the effectiveness of incentive-based mechanisms for conservation. Apart from that, she's just lovely and brilliant, and she does incredible research and is an inspiration for young men and women in academia around the world who want to make a difference and who also want to do brilliant research in the meantime. So thank you, EJ.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here and to be talking. And I just wanted to say, given that I've got the stage, thank you so much to everyone who's organized this meeting, because it's been great. Yeah. Okay, so let's get my slide up. Yeah, press. Hey. I'm going to start with a painful revelation, which I hope you'll take and comfort me with, which is that I turned 50 last month. I haven't quite got over it, but I'm working on it. But what that means for you is that I was sort of in on the birth of conservation biology in its modern format. So this is me, aged 18, graduating from school. You could marvel at the teenage haircuts of the 1980s, while also realizing that that meant that during my undergraduate time, this book came out by Michael Soule, which kind of laid the foundations for conservation biology, and also this book came out by E.O. Wilson, which kind of coined the term biodiversity. How exciting is that as a time to be an undergraduate and then starting off in conservation? However, if we look on the dark side, you can then start calculating all the things that have gone wrong in the time that I've been a conservation biologist. And maybe this is the most used slide in the entire conference, but I've put in when I became an undergraduate, and you can see there's a third of the biodiversity was lost on my watch. Things no better in Europe, all gone to pot there as well. While I've been a conservationist, 9 bird species have gone extinct. Some mammals, sorry about the plant people, don't get recorded. So here I am giving a little recording of one species that I particularly like that also has gone extinct. This is the baiji. There were a few hundred when I started my undergraduate and probably none now. Okay, so that's been noticed at international levels, and of course there have been some international responses. 1992, the CBD, a big thing. 2015, particularly good year for international responses. We had the Paris Agreement, we had the SDGs. There's been some actual conservation action in response to that. In particular, protected area coverage has gone up a lot in the time that I've been around as a conservationist, so that's cool. And actually, there's been starting to be some recognition that conservation has made a difference. So here's a really important piece of work by Mike Hoffman and colleagues, which looks at the difference that conservation makes to ungulates. And what we've got here is it's a counterfactual thing, which is important. So it shows what the status would have been in the absence of conservation. So you can see on the grey here, that's the red list category that that the species are currently in, and the black is their best guess at what red list category these species would have been in the absence of conservation. And although they're still threatened, they're not as threatened as they would have been. So progress has been made. However, I think in the kind of 30 years that I've been in conservation, we've never been more gloomy. The prevailing narrative is this kind of stuff. I hate these rhino pictures. I wish people would stop putting them up. There's the kind of apocalyptic narratives are very prevalent nowadays in our field, I think. Okay, so maybe we don't buy into the fully apocalyptic narrative, but I think we could all probably buy into this, which is that we're making progress, but we're not making enough progress. There are good ideas, they're being learned about, they're being taken to other areas, there are bright spots, but they're not going to scale. We're having international responses, but they're not bold enough, they're not being implemented effectively enough. And that's been bringing to, in the last couple of years, many more people calling for radical change. And these kinds of things like nature needs half are starting to get credence in the conservation discourse as a kind of call to arms. Okay, so I'm afraid I'm not going to give you the answer in this talk. What I'm going to give you is a couple of lessons, or 4 lessons from my time as a conservationist so far, which I hope kind of take you through the trajectory of what I've been doing and give some tips from my perspective about how we can do better. So 2 of them are about better conservation practice, and 2 of them are about better conservation outreach. And I have a teenage son. So in honor of teenagers everywhere, I'm going to be giving you some top tips in red italics, because there's nothing that teenagers like more than being told by their parents how to live their lives. So, Rowan, this is for you. So, models are our friends. This is the first one. There's many good things about models. They help us to be transparent, to think about our assumptions, to explore options, to think about uncertainties, and that allows us to give robust advice. Great. You can divide them into 3 broad categories. You can have conceptual qualitative models that represent our assumptions, explain our concepts, frame our research ideas. You can have mechanistic models that represent how systems work, that allow you to explore uncertainties and explore our assumptions. And you can have statistical or empirical models that describe and understand patterns in the data. Okay, so now, given that models are our friends, I'm going to give about 15 minutes worth of explanation about models, and I'm going to start with 2 cautionary tales. So these are early models that I did very early in my career. And I'll tell you what happened with them. So the first one is for the Saiga antelope, and this is my favorite species. You'll be seeing it dotted through the presentation. This was an early Saiga model, which was a Leslie matrix model, for those of you who like this kind of thing. And basically, it was talking about sustainable hunting. So what's the sustainable level of hunting that you can do of Saigas? And the answer was about 10%. The complexity is that they hunt for males, so it's the degree of selectivity for males was also part of it. Great, nice model. I thought so anyway. What happened with this model? Well, nothing. They were abstract, they were created because I was interested in population ecology. They were never used. And those of you who've tried to engage with practitioners will know why. I made them on my own, I published them, I expected everyone in Kazakhstan to read the Journal of Applied Ecology and say, hey, brilliant, yeah, I'll do that. After that, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Saiga population collapsed, sustainable use was off the agenda. Ironically enough, in the last couple of years, the Kazakh government have started to think about sustainable use, and I say, hey, my model, but it's 25 years old now, they don't care, it's old. So, there you go. Lesson 1. Okay, model 2. This was my very first paper, I was so proud of it. This was about ivory harvesting, and what it was that it was another population model, a Leslie matrix model, but in this case I fitted the model to distributions of ivory tusks in stockpiles. The one that's a bit pointy is from Africa, it's a big stockpile in Tanzania, and the one that's a bit smooth is from a big stockpile in Singapore, and I did the best fit to that tusk distribution that would give you the hunting mortality and the selectivity for large males, selectivity for large horns, and tusks. They nicely both agreed that about 12% hunting mortality was probably what had happened over the last few years, and that was then linked to the decline of the elephant. Oh, and by the way, I was really keen on 3D graphs when I was young, and people kept telling me they were really bad, and I sort of agree with them now. So this was very different, because this was in a political context. This was in the run-up to the 1989 listing of the elephant on CITES Appendix 1. And just a tip here about history, so that's an article from 1978 in The Nation of Kenya. That could have been this year. So we're still very concerned about the ivory trade, but that concern is not new. And at the time, there were lots of kind of conservation interventions happening. That's the big ivory burn in Kenya. Excitingly, I was there. I'm under the tree. So excited. This model was used. It was used as the evidence for CITES uplisting decisions in 1989 because they wanted to know, they wanted to be able to say that unsustainable use was the best explanation for declines in elephant populations. It was done as a consultancy to CITES that my supervisor had. I was very lucky. At the same time, it taught me some other lessons about the fact that your work will always be used for political gain. So I wrote, 20 pages of assumptions, caveats, limitations about my model. The only thing they wanted to know was 12%. 12%, that was it. And they used this according to how they wanted to. So that scared me off rather for about 20 years working in the ivory field. Many conservationists don't like models, despite how interesting and useful they can be. you get kind of conflicting approaches. Some people say they're too abstract to be useful, and some people say they're too complicated to be understandable. I find that contradiction interesting. But I think there's some fundamental things within our discipline that mean that conservationists don't use models as much as they should, and the potential to inform decision-making is underexploited, and that's to do mostly, I think, with training and interaction with practitioners. Okay, so now I'm going to fast forward to this year, and I'm going to talk about how now I've got a project that's using modelling, and try to explain to you why I think this is the way that we should be using modelling. And that story actually starts a long time ago. It starts 20 years ago with this paper by Jackman and Bilio. And I was interested in anti-poaching at the time. And I read this paper, I was very interested in it, but I was also very perturbed. I thought there was something slightly wrong here. So what they've got is, on the x-axis, they've got a range of different measures of effort. So it's the law enforcement budget, kilometres squared walked by rangers, effective investigation days by anti-poaching people, and on the y-axis, they've got the thing that I care about, which is the number of elephants killed illegally. So they were interested to find out how law enforcement effort translated into the thing they cared about, elephant deaths. And that's all very well, but I thought, hang on, you can't just do a linear regression between those two things. There's all sorts of processes underlying that relationship that you can't just put into a regression. Okay, well, I thought that, and then I didn't do anything about it. This is the other kind of data that you often get from law enforcement patrols, similar kind of thing. This is from Hannah O'Kelly's PhD in Saimaa Protected Forest in Cambodia. So what you can see here is that the grid cells that are grey are places that the rangers have been, and then the purple are the number of snares found per unit of effort, so the number of snares found per visit, basically, and you can see the intensity there. So that's very common kind of data that we get from law enforcement. Okay, let me just tell you how that data is obtained. So what we're interested in is the number of snares laid in the forest, and that might be like this red layer. Okay, so just as you saw in Hannah's thing, not every place is visited. So there's a whole area over here that wasn't visited, so as far as we know, there's no snares there. Of those places visited, not every snare is going to be found. It's quite hard to find snares in forests, and so you've got a detectability bias as well. You're only going to see certain numbers of snares, and then you're also only going to report some. Maybe your technology doesn't work, maybe you're given a bit of a backhander, maybe you just couldn't be bothered, and so there's a reporting bias. And so what is the thing that we want and the thing that we see can be extremely different depending on these biases. And yet the thing that we see is what people use in management. And we can make a conceptual model that kind of links through these processes. So we've got the animals in the forest, we've got some snares, we've got the patrols, and then the snares are recorded. There's a big complication here in that the whole point of law enforcement is to deter poaching. And so the fact that patrols present should be deterring your poaching and therefore feeding back through to the number of snares laid. That's the whole point of law enforcement. We get other feedbacks like the snares will be laid in the place where the animals are, but then the snares will reduce the animal numbers, and so you get a feedback there. And then you've got the snares, the patrols recording snares, and that drives their patrolling effort. They go to places where they've seen snares already, and so you get a feedback there as well. Okay, so then you can start to make some more conceptual models that kind of make simple linkages between the things we care about and the things we're seeing. So we might hypothesize that the number of snares recorded will go up as the number of snares laid increases. That seems obvious enough. We might also assume that as patrol effort in a place goes up, poaching effort in the place will go down. Seems obvious enough as well. And based on that and this diagram, you would then say, okay, well, as patrol effort goes up, we would expect a parabolic relationship. So you'd first start by getting lots of snares, and then you'd get deterrence, and then you'd get fewer snares. And that would be a mark of a successful enterprise. Of course, this is all complexified by the fact that deterrence and detection depend upon the kind of hunting that you're doing. So it'll be different for snares that are laid in the forest from guys with guns, from poaching signs that you're detecting. And so all these things will mean that these relationships will vary in time and space. So the whole point of this, the upshot of this, is my PhD student Aidan Keen's insight that you might see a pattern here, which is snares per unit effort that you detect as a function of the effort you put into looking for them, you might get an observed pattern like this, but that can be generated by lots of different underlying processes. And this goes back to Jackman and Biglio's study before. So this is what they were reporting on. And my worry is now expressed by my student here, which is that you might have deterrence here. You might have very sharp, effective deterrence from effort, so very effective deterrence, but also have your detectability going up very fast with effort as you get better and better at checking out snares, leading to this kind of relationship. Or you might get a linear relationship between effort and detection and no deterrence at all. Completely different management recommendations would come from those two sets of graphs. You can't tell from the observational data. This is just a picture that was taken by my RA, Harriet Ibbett, out in the forest in Saimaa in Cambodia again, just to demonstrate detectability is a problem. So we've been setting artificial snares and then trying to find them again, not snares that would catch anything. And this is just a snapshot of the forest. Here's the artificial snare that this guy's just laid, and you can see how difficult it might be to see that in the forest. Right, okay, so this is the project that we're currently doing, which is a collaborative project that's trying to understand how best to interpret these kinds of law enforcement data in a better way. So the important thing I first want to say to you is that we started from what we want. What do we want here on the conservation side? What do we want is two things. First of all, we want general rules of thumb for people around the world who are doing protected area management to help them to see when their data might be useless and very biased and when their data might be okay and usable. So general rules of thumb. And our colleagues in Saimaa wanted some specific guidance about how to best deploy their patrols. Okay, so that's what we want. The next thing we need to start with is what do we already know? So in the literature in general, there's information about hunter and ranger behavior, and there's existing data sets for Saimaa. And this will allow us to understand what the major uncertainties are that we need to fill in order to make a difference to our advice. So we don't go after any uncertainties. We don't go after the most academically interesting uncertainties. We go after the uncertainties that will qualitatively change our advice. Okay, so now we start thinking about what we're going to do. A conceptual model and a mechanistic model, an abstract model to explore our assumptions. So that's exploring those shapes of those graphs that I showed you earlier. A more detailed abstract mechanistic model for Saimaa particularly that will help to guide strategy. We picked out two things that were really important and not in the data sets already to focus our data collection effort on, and that was the motivations of hunters and rangers and snare detectability. We did some we're doing some statistical modeling to analyze the actual patrol observation patterns. That's what people usually do. And then we can use that to validate, cross-validate with our mechanistic abstract models to see which ones are working or not. Okay, so that's a long way from my very first models, I think. This is what we put in the grant proposal for those of you who are modeling geeks and want to read the actual names of the models. Swiftly on. Okay, so here's a nice picture of our collaborative team to make the point about the fact that modeling needs to be collaborative to work. So we've got our WCS friends here who are going to implement it. We've got some statistical models, some mechanistic models, some conceptual models, and me. Okay, so that's my first lesson. My second lesson is about learning from the bowerbird. And this is really just about interdisciplinarity. The bowerbird is a great bird that goes around collecting shiny things from all around the place and making their nest look more beautiful. And that's basically what I think we need to do. This is from my PhD again, and this is me. So I did my PhD in a fisheries lab, a fisheries modelling lab. I was the only terrestrial person in a fisheries lab, so that was pretty cool because I learnt lots of fisheries stuff. And I learned generally about how natural resource managers think about the world. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool to think of the rhino horns as monoculture plantations? And then we can use forestry models to model the optimal frequency of dehorning of rhinos. And this is a forestry model which shows the optimal frequency. This is the sustainable one. This is the profit maximizing one that you might expect the managers to use. This is the kind of open access poacher one. And I was very heartened. Well, heartened is probably the wrong word. I was gratified that the poachers who were killing rhinos that had been dehorned were killing them at about just after a year. So yeah, top tip for students, if you want to look really original, go and delve in somebody else's field. Okay, so now to talk about interdisciplinarity, I'm going to talk about Sayga parasites and diseases and give you another cautionary tale. Okay, so in my first lectureship, I went to the University of Warwick, And there were a load of epidemiologists there. I wanted to be friends with people in my new department, and so I supervised a couple of vet students to do epidemiological PhDs. So this is Monica, who was working on viruses, of course Tigers, because that's what I like. Monica worked on viruses, and Eric worked on parasites. I'm just going to give you a little example of some of the work that Eric did, which was about Marshalagia, which is this nematode here that's shared between sheep and Tigers. Okay, so Tigers are migratory. They move up to 1,000 kilometers here and here between their winter pastures in the deserts in the south, where it's not so snowy, and then into the summer pastures here, where there's lots of nice grass in the steppes, backwards and forwards. Some sheep also move backwards and forwards, but most of them stick around here or here. Okay, so here's the life cycle of Marshalagia. What you have is you have eggs in the grass, in the soil, sorry, in the grass, and they kind of develop through a range of different stages. They come up, they crawl onto the grass, they get eaten by the animal, they develop into nematodes, and then they lay their eggs into the gut, and that goes back into the grass like that. So what was cool about Eric's model was that he did it for different life stages of sheep and tigers, so different ages, and also different areas. So like I just showed you in the graphic there, the northern area where the summer was, the central and the south. Okay. This was published in 2006. I want you to remember that date. Okay, so here's the result, which I think is pretty cool. And this is the percentage of the nematodes transmitted from a model that came from tigers or sheep into sheep. So this is the percentage of what the sheep have that comes from a different species. So this is the transhuman sheep. This is tigers into tigers. So tigers don't transmit much to themselves. And what you can basically see is the tigers are a big role in transmitting to sheep in the north. So they pick up the eggs in the south in their winter ground, they take them north, and they give them to the sheep in the north and then come back again. Now that's useful for management because then you can treat the sheep in the south before the tigers get there so that they don't chuck the eggs out onto the grass, and then you can treat the sheep in the north after the tigers have arrived so that any eggs that came from the tiger can be flushed out. Okay, that's cool. 2006, remember? Okay, so in 2006, the tiger was undergoing all sorts of disastrous things, which I'll come to later, but we all got together under the Convention on Migratory Species to do an action plan that was signed up to by the governments and the NGOs about conservation of tigers, full of all sorts of things that needed to be done in priority actions, covering a range of different things. I wrote that action plan, well, wrote the first draft anyway. There was nothing about parasites or diseases in that at all. Okay, I was publishing about disease, not writing it in the action plan. We'll come back to that. Let's come back to it now, in fact. Because tigers have a lot of diseases, and there's been quite a lot of mass death of tigers, even in the time that I've been working on them. So in 1988, 270,000 tigers died in that population where Eric was doing his work. In 2015, 200,000 tigers died in the same place. In 1988, that was about half the population. In 2015, that was more than 80% of the population. That's a huge disaster. It was within a couple of weeks in the birth grounds. Okay, so clearly diseases are important, and they were known to be important. That's why my students started work on them in the first place, and yet they didn't go into the action plan. Okay, we'll leave you to contemplate my stupidity there. Currently, we've got a viral disease, which is running in the Mongolian subspecies. It's an endemic subspecies, was about 10 to 12,000 animals. It's called PPR, Peste Petit Ruminant, and it comes from livestock. It's vaccinatable. It's been going through the world since 1942, when it was first seen in Côte d'Ivoire. And funnily enough, Monica, my student, in 1999 to 2000, tested for PPR. She did a general test for any viruses in the livestock of Kazakhstan, and found it at very small numbers. So it should not have been a surprise to anybody that it was coming through. And yet, the livestock weren't vaccinated. The tigers are on the brink of extinction. 80% we think are going to die of this 10,000 strong population. Okay, so let's move on to something a bit more positive, which is about interdisciplinarity. Remember, that's what I was talking about, which is that now, unlike before, we mobilized an enormous team of interdisciplinary scientists from a range of different backgrounds to work on this. And here they are. There's Eric again, I got him back. And we've been working really hard on this problem and found out what it was. So it's called Pasteurella. It's a bacterium that's commensal in Saiga noses, and something had triggered it to virulence. So here's some thingies that I don't understand that tell you that it's Pasteurella. Here's vets like chopping things up in the fields. So that's what they do and find all this nasty stuff. And I was more involved in this, which is a kind of relatively complicated spatial model that tried to look at the 3 diaph years we have data on, 81, 88, and 2015. That shows that there's a very strong relationship between relative humidity in the 10 days before the onset of the disease. So if it was more than 80% relative humidity, then the Saigas die. I noticed on the way in that it's 72% here, so we're probably okay. And there's a weaker relationship with temperature. Okay, so stay awake, I think, is the main message of this. So in terms of science, what these stories tell me is that you find an area that fascinates you, where there's an important practical issue and a clear need for science. And importantly, I think my secret of my success has been looking for places where people are already doing something, but there's a vacuum of theory and there's a vacuum of methods, and that's what we need. And so I've put up a few buzzwords. These are all things that my team has been working on in the last 5 years that are things where I think that this is true, that people are implementing without enough theory, and we can help as scientists. Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the next bit, which is more about outreach. So even if we do things better as conservation scientists, and there are many ways that we can do things better, that is not going to save the world. We're only going to save the world if we reach out to the rest of it. So just as I've been saying that other disciplines are important to engage, like vets and other people, we also need artists and marketeers and civil servants and housewives and financial people. And this was really nicely put in a tweet by Heather Caldaway, born out of frustration of being at a workshop and people standing up saying, I'm not a conservationist, but very diffidently, and then having a great idea. Okay, so we're launching I Am a Conservationist today, and this is my husband looking a bit sheepish. This is my mother, my PhD student, and the cousin of one of my PhD students, who are respectively an engineer, an artist, she's not a ballerina, she'd kill me for that. She's a ballroom dancer, that's right, and a call centre person. So this is what I think we need to do. We need to get some enthusiasm going in the rest of the world. Okay, so even if everyone decided that they were a conservationist, which they won't, and decided that it was a priority for them to save the world, there are still a lot of barriers that we face, and I think there are some important ones. So many of the people who want to work in conservation have language barriers. They feel excluded because they can't understand English. When we work in a place, we tend to be more powerful than the local people. They feel resentment that we're coming in and telling them what to do. The general public get all interested in conservation, and then they see these rhino dehorning photos all the time and get despairing and give up. Conservationists are banging their heads against these intractable problems all the time, and they suffer burnout and exhaustion and despair. And then so many people who want to do conservation, particularly in the developing world, are doing great work, but they don't have the capacity, they don't have the training, they don't have the access to training and funding that will allow them to do their jobs. And I just got a top tip there for English speakers. Learn another language, guys. So I did that. So this is Saiga News. This is something that I produced in 2006. It's had 10 years now, in all the languages that are important to Saiga conservation, because I was getting really cross that there was all sorts of work being done in conservation on the ground, but there were international people talking about Saigas at international level, and there was no way to connect these people in either direction. So the international people knew that what was being done on the ground, and the people on the ground knew what was happening at international level. So Saiga News, all you ever wanted to know about Saigas, great read if you like that kind of thing. So it's meant to be good for the chief of a village and for a CITES negotiation. They'll all find good stuff in there. Of course, we're starting to breach these barriers much more now. There's a lot of online sharing. There's a lot of positivity and collectivism starting to build up, and more democratization. I think the humility on the part of the powerful is not quite as far advanced as some of the other things, but hopefully we'll get there in the end. So a group of us set up quite recently, and the new website is launching today, something called Conservation Optimism. which is trying to address these barriers. Now, some of you might think, well, that's a bit naive to be optimistic in the face of all these disasters and the LPI continuing to go down. I don't see it as something naive. I see it as something positive that's going to galvanize us, that will allow us to learn lessons and share lessons and thereby get better and more positive as conservationists. So through my background working in places where there is no English language spoken, we've got a Google Translate button, so you can read it in whichever language you like, and you can upload stuff in whichever language you like, and it will be automatically translated. So for our Spanish friends here, Spanish-speaking friends here, here it is in Spanish. You can laugh at the Google Translate errors later, perhaps. And here's a shout out to any Khmer speakers in the audience. Do we have any? Yay, Alex, well done. Here's our Twitter feed in Khmer. Okay, so here I am on my last lesson now, which is don't give up. So I think the Saiga thing is a really good example of don't give up. It might not look like a very optimistic graph, this one, particularly in terms of my influence. So here I started my Saiga work. Here's the huge things that caused the decline in Saigas: massive geopolitical changes, the breakup of the Soviet Union, which led a few years later to economic collapse in the range states and massive, massive poaching. Interestingly, you can see the conservation response coming in at the international level. CITES was a bit ahead of the time, but CMS and the IUCN Red List all happened in about 2000, 2001, thanks to some work that we published. It was put on critically endangered from least threatened, so a massive, near threatened, a massive jump in Red List. This is where the kind of actual conservation action on the ground kicked in, so that was 5 years later than the international listing responses. So the CMS MOU that I talked about earlier was written and signed in 2006, and the Saiga Conservation Alliance, which is the NGO that I founded and chair of, started in 2006. Here's where it went wrong again. But look, last week I got this year's Saiga figures, and they're a little bit higher. Hey, so it takes a long, long time to save a species, and sometimes things go wrong on the way. And the reason why I'm optimistic, apart from being generally an optimistic kind of person, is this. So this is us setting up the Saiga Conservation Alliance in 2007. This is our first meeting. This is a 2015 meeting, and what we're doing here is we're giving awards for young conservation leadership to 3 range state conservationists who are doing great work leading conservation and the future, because we realize that we were old farts, and if you carry on with just us leading it, there will be no future in the end. So these are the future for Saiga conservation, and that's why I'm optimistic. It takes a long time to save a species. You might say Saiga not quite saved that yet, but we've only been going for 20 years or so. Carl Jones is an inspiration. He works for Durrell. He went for a long, long time. It took him 30 years to get the pink pigeon of Mauritius from 16 individuals to 400 individuals when they were secure. And there's a handful of other species that he has saved. And you just have to realize that you're going to have to hang in for the long haul if you're going to actually make a difference. And Durrell started to recognize this with their Durrell Index, which just looks at the counterfactual of where the species they work on would have been in the absence of their work, and here's where they are now. I think the more conservation organizations start to think in this way, the better it will be. Okay, let me bring you back to where I started, doom and gloom. This is Saimar Wildlife Sanctuary. These are photos that were taken by my RA, Harriet, last year. So we've got deforestation, we've got bushmeat, we've got lots and lots of logging, we've got orchids. Shout out to the plant people there. Yeah, so things aren't all rosy. But this graph really struck me when I saw it in a seminar recently. This is trying to represent the rate of change of big social changes in America. So these are the number of states in America. This is the time at which socially liberal things got embedded into the legislation in America. So when they became kind of normal practice of society. Okay. So what we've got here is interracial marriage. we've got here is prohibition, women's suffrage, abortion, same-sex marriage, marijuana. So this is really cool, because what it shows is you have these great long periods of nothing happening, and then sudden switches, and things become commonplace. So I wonder, as conservationists, whether we're really frustrated because we're here and there's like a long way to go before we have that sudden switch into people realizing that conservation is important. Or are we really frustrated because we're pushing and we're here and we're about to see that big societal change? Well, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's an interesting one to think about. So what have I learned in 30 years in conservation science? I think my career development has relatively closely followed developments in the field, and that we're getting a little bit more integrated, we're getting more interdisciplinary, we're getting a bit more thoughtful about things. So I think we're getting there. And I think we also need to remember when we're thinking about how bad things are, that we've come a long way. You know, let's not forget that we now have some international recognition of conservation as an important issue, and that we do have bright spots, we do have things to learn, we do have interdisciplinarity, we do have social science. This meeting has been the most interdisciplinary I've ever been to. I think we do still need a radical shift, but we are a global community here, and we're the ones who can engender this radical shift. So I'm just going to finish with just a few reflections from the Conservation Optimism Summit, which we held in April. And this is people who are at the summit just saying why they are conservation optimists. And I think their words will speak for themselves. Okay, and I'll just leave you with the reflection that Tigers are brilliant, and thank you very much.
Thank you, EJ. So we've got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions. So any questions?
Yeah, there's one thing there. There's a couple of miles away over there.
Yeah, thank you for a very enjoyable and inspirable talk. My name is Volker Maufer, University of Vienna, Austria. I tell my students also at the end of my classes always optimism is duty, because otherwise they can go to industry and destroy nature. So, and they like this message. And my question would be, I like your top tips, especially the interdisciplinary ones, yeah? And I see another tendency, we multiply knowledge in different fields. Universities are still faculty-based, and knowledge gets more and more in those faculties, and career chances are better perhaps if you stay in a faculty. So how to motivate people to go more interdisciplinary? How to do this in the practice, in education? What would be your particular tips, additional to the ones which you gave already? Thank you.
Thank you. So my thought is that that's where it's exciting. I think that's where you have to sell the students that interdisciplinary work is edgy, it keeps your brain alive, it keeps you interested. You can go and be a boring, I don't know, I'm going to be rude about evolutionary biologist or something, and spend your life in a lab and get really, really famous. Or you can be an interdisciplinary scientist and really challenge your brain. That's what I'd say to a student. Is that very rude?
I'm Kate Kristen. I'm at Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and I've been aware of your world of interdisciplinarity because of Simon Pooley, who's environmental historian. I missed the beginning of your talk, but I know that you're working with environmental historians as well, and that's what my field is. My question is, because we've been working, the Earth Optimism Summit that happened at Smithsonian, same time in April, and we were connecting with you guys, and I'm wondering, what are your key next steps with your conservation optimism activities, like next year or 2 years? What are your key upcoming things with that?
Brilliant question, yeah. And so the Earth Optimism was an inspiration. Nancy Knowlton, who runs it and also started Ocean Optimism, is a massive inspiration. And Heather Calderway, who gave that tweet also. So the idea for the Conservation Optimism website is to magnify the voices that are coming from everywhere else and to link in with them, so that we follow Earth Optimism and Ocean Optimism, and there's a place on our website where you can see everything that's going through from Earth Optimism and Ocean Optimism. And I hope that there'll be lots of different optimism things, so you can see other kinds of optimism going on. You know, how about grasslands optimism for the Saiga fans? And we can put them all through our website, and I think it's another way of getting to a different constituency that we can all do together. And I think we've got a meeting in October where we're going to talk about that a bit more. I would encourage anyone who wants to do a Conservation Optimism Summit in your country, do it. We can give you some tips. We can help you to find funding.
Hi, Pavel Dodonov from State University of Santa Cruz in Brazil. And just wondering, what do you think would have happened to the Saiga population if the Soviet Union had not collapsed?
I think it would have been fine. Yeah, there's a really interesting graph that I show sometimes when I want to talk about politics, which is the kind of twin evils of communism and capitalism. So before communism came in and there was collectivization, things were okay. Communism came along, collectivized the livestock. Saigers were so before communism, in the 19th century, saigers were almost hunted to extinction in those areas, and many other species were extirpated from the Russian Empire, because they had a similar thing to the British Empire and the French Empire in Africa, just going out exploiting big game. They loved it. So huge amounts of saiga hunting, saiga at very, very low levels in the 1920s. Then communism came along, guns were restricted, the border was shut with China, they're used for Chinese traditional medicine, saiga population recovered, and then saiga was going along just fine, and Soviet Union collapsed, and it collapsed. That's from the wildlife perspective. From the human perspective, what we found was collectivization that led to massive human suffering, massive loss of livestock, people evacuating from the steppe. That was gradually improved. And then again, when capitalism came in, again, a massive decline in human well-being, from which they're now recovering. So it's complicated, but I think the saiga would have been fine if the Soviet had started. But it wasn't going to stay, was it? It was going to collapse at some point.
Hi, I'm Emily Nicholson, Deakin University, Australia. Great talk, thank you, EJ. I guess more pertinent maybe for our work is where would the saiga have been without those conservation interventions, like the counterfactual from when we collectively, you started doing stuff?
So I've actually got the answer to that because we're working on a paper which is about that. I think there's a fairly strong case that it would have been, it's currently critically endangered, but until the disease, we were thinking it really had to be downlisted to maybe vulnerable. You know, it couldn't have stayed at critically endangered for much longer because it was recovering very fast. But it didn't actually make it to being downlisted because of the disease. Hopefully it'll come soon. But there's a case to be made that it would have been critically endangered on the verge to maybe extirpation in some of the areas. Yeah.
You referred several times to a sort of undefined radical change. And I have a few ideas, but I'm wondering, based upon your 30 years experience, if you had anything particularly in mind.
If I'd had a really good idea, I'd have put it in the talk. I think actually, okay, it has to be a patchwork. There's no one solution to this. I think conservation optimism is my best shot at what I can do to promote radical change. I think there has to be huge institutional change at the international level. I think there has to be governments really need to believe that conservation is part of the sustainability of what they do. That's on its way, but it's not. I'm not a kind of international relations person, so I can't say how best to make that happen.
Hi, EJ. Thank you so much for your energy and your passion. My name is Adam Spencer. I'm with Filmmakers for Conservation, and I just encourage everyone in this room, to tweet now why we are optimists using I am a conservationist or conservation optimism as a hashtag, and also put little videos up there too. Thank you.
You're my best friend. I'll buy you a drink later.
It's to Mary David Walgenbach from Madison, Wisconsin. What is your experience with faith-based organizations, and do you count them as energy for optimism, or what is your response to the faith-based groups?
Absolutely, of course. Yes, they're an incredibly important part of conservation and conservation optimism. So going back to the Saiga story, and if you're not all bored by it, one of the things we did in Russia in particular, the area that the Saigas are in is the only Buddhist area in Europe. It's from people from Mongolian backgrounds, and Buddhism is something that's very important to them, but it was crushed under the Soviet period. So part of the breakup of the Soviet Union allowed these Buddhist faiths to re-emerge as part of the national discourse within this place. It's called Kalmykia. And so we've worked extensively with Buddhist leaders in Kalmykia to help them, because they want to make a statement around the importance of wildlife and nature in the Buddhist faith. And in fact, completely independent to us, in the main square of the capital of Kalmykia, there's a picture of the old white man, who is the local Buddhist entity for the Kalmyks, and he's got a saiga at his side. So that's lovely. The only downside of this, I shouldn't give these stories that are really, really good and then have a but. But the but is that if you talk to local people in the city, they say, oh, it's a sheep. No, it's a saiga. Of course it is. But the kind of legend about it is that the old white man, there was a nasty man trying to shoot saigas, and the old white man intervened and turned the hunter into a saiga, and then he had to run away, and it was bad. So yeah, he's the kind of patron of saigas and the patron of Kalmyk Buddhism.
We'll take one more. There's one here.
Hi, my name is Tifa, and I'm from the Calgary Zoo. I am a conservation optimist, so I'll just state that now. However, I feel like to be a good conservation optimist, we have to have a healthy understanding of where reality is. And sometimes I feel like we gloss over what the state of reality is in promotion of saying we can do better, we can get there, and we can, save the world. But we really have to understand how far or how much effort we have to put in before we can actually save that. So I don't know if you have any comments about that.
I think you're right. So if you go to our website, you can enter a conservation optimism story in whatever language you like, and we're looking for a range of them. And when we say an optimistic story, we don't necessarily mean a story of success. We mean a story in which you've learnt, a story which makes you feel that you can do better, and not just a story of, we did this really cool thing and it's all better now. In fact, there's a saiga story in there which is certainly mixed, so you can all go and read it.
Right, thank you very much. One more? Okay, go on. Last one.
Is that on? Thanks. Thanks for the great talk. It was very inspiring, a good way to end the conference. I work on international policy for the New Zealand government, and so I was very happy to see the connections that you made to different processes. Can you talk to how you managed to get your science into the international policy making, and maybe provide advice for people who might be interested in doing that? Thank you.
Yeah, so as you saw, I got my science into CITES in a rather kind of, I had no idea as a first year PhD student that my stuff would be debated at CITES, so that was just a consultancy that my supervisor had. I've been very involved with the Convention on Migratory Species for a long time, and I think I was a kind of international policy skeptic to start with, because I didn't see why lots of people sitting around talking at high-level meetings had anything to do with saiga conservation on the ground. And being involved has completely changed my way of thinking about that, because governments really care about UN conventions, surprisingly so, and the action plans that we've put in place over the 10 years of working with CMS have really made a difference to the focus that the governments have put on things, the importance that they have placed, and building a community and a network that includes both government people and conservationists and scientists. So I would encourage all of you who are working on a species or who are working in a particular area, get involved in these policy processes, get involved in the CMS or CITES or the CBD, IPBES. It's worth it because you can actually influence the way that people think. I was lucky with CMS because, there aren't very many people who work on SIGAs, so, I got in there, but I think there's space for us to talk more.
So before I end, I thought we could take a picture for the conservation optimism movement, but if everybody kind of stands up. And here's our photographer, and EJ has to be here in the front. And you have to look really optimistic. Woo! Right, 1, 2, 3. Woo! Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, EJ. Thanks.